It's 2025 and a new year means brand new opportunities. And for a lot of you out there, I know you've been thinking about one thing over the holidays, and that is starting your own business. But you have so many questions like, how do I get started? How do I come up with a brand? How do I even sell stuff to people? And what am I even going to sell? Now take a deep breath. Shopify has got you. Shopify makes it simple to create your brand, open for business, and get your first sale. And you can get your store up and running easily with thousands of customizable templates. You don't have to be a coding nerd or a design geek to get this done. All you need to do is drag and drop. Shopify also helps with the details like shipping, taxes, and payments from one single dashboard, so you can focus on the important stuff, like growing your business. Established in 2025 has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/truecrime, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/truecrime to start selling with Shopify today. Shopify.com/truecrime.
I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my Tater co-host, Brett.
Tater?
Tater.
Like a potato?
No, it's from Marie, and she told me that this is the latest word in bourbon whiskey parlance for an enthusiast who perpetuates the category's newly found hype culture. So I don't know if you have newly found bourbon whiskey culture. It's more like you're one of its oldest flag bearers.
Yeah. I feel like I'm being lumped in with like Johnny Come Lately. I'm not on the bandwagon here. I've been with bourbon since way before bourbon was cool. If bourbon ever wasn't cool, I was still there.
Okay, the definition here, Marie, this is a great word, thank you. The definition here are taters are the type to run to liquor stores upon hearing a bottle is getting hot. Like, say, if it won an award. I think you just run to the liquor store to get liquor.
Exactly. I'm always running to the liquor store. I'll give you that. I don't need for the liquor to be hot to buy it. So.
Well, and sorry, Marie, you had sent that to me a while ago, and it's been on my list to call you because I am terrible at, making some pun on the case that we're doing. And today, honestly, there's so much to discuss about today's case that I thought Tater was appropriate because you're a Tater. I guess you're a whiskey lover. But,
yeah.
no.
And whiskey was popular in the Old West. That was what the cowboys drank.
Look at
the saloon before the gunfight. So, I'm just saying.
Look at you. Okay. Brett is stepping up the game of drawing connections between our descriptors and what we're talking about. Brett. Alec Baldwin has been in the news a lot because, as you guys probably remember, when he was filming his Western movie, Alec Baldwin was holding a prop gun that was actually a real gun, and it had a live round in it. And he claims that he did not know it was a live round, and the gun went off, and the bullet tragically struck and killed Helena Hutchins, who was the director of photography on that Western film. And why Alec Baldwin has been in the news because charges have been brought against him for involuntary manslaughter. And this has caused a lot of kerfuffle as people are trying to understand if he was rightly charged and what's going to happen.
And of course, you guys wanted to know what we thought, and that's the whole purpose of this podcast. So here we are, and we're going to walk through with you the law in New Mexico, the charges, whether or not we think the charges will stick. I think the best way to start, though, is to read the press release that was put out by the district attorney on her Facebook page to give you, the initial, at least, justification by the authorities about why they are pursuing this charge.
By the way, we've come so far in, news releases that now we post them to Facebook. There was a time, by the way, I remember in law school where they basically warned us all against having any social media presence whatsoever. And now, most breaking news from law offices are on Twitter and Facebook.
Oh, absolutely. If you're a lawyer now and you're in private practice and you don't have social media presence, you got a problem.
Yeah.
So here's how the press release goes. New Mexico First Judicial District Attorney Mary Carmack Altwise announced on Thursday that in keeping with her commitment to pursue justice for all victims and to hold everyone accountable under the law, her office, before the end of the month, will file criminal charges in the Rust film set shooting, which this is another interesting fact. People keep saying that Alec Baldwin has been charged. He actually hasn't been charged yet. They have told us they are going to charge him, and they will do that by the end of the month. Rust actor and producer Alec Baldwin and armorer Hannah Gutierrez Reed will each be charged with 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter in the death of Helena Hutchins on the film's Santa Fe County set in 2021. Assistant Director David Halls has signed a plea agreement for the charge of negligent use of a deadly weapon. The terms include a suspended sentence and 6 months of probation. A copy of the plea agreement will be available after it has been filed with the court. No charges will be filed specific to the non-fatal shooting of Rust director Joel Souza.
This is so interesting on so many levels because that's a great point, Brett. You know, the news mostly reports that Alec Baldwin and Hannah Gutierrez Reed have already been charged, but I don't think I've really ever seen this instance where before the charges are actually brought, they are announced for a lot of reasons, because I don't know if they've already run them through the grand jury here. Maybe they have and they just haven't brought them yet, but there's usually some secrecy before a charge is brought. The press release continues. After a thorough review of the evidence and the laws of the state of New Mexico, I have determined that there is sufficient evidence to file criminal charges against Alec Baldwin and other members of the Rust film crew, Carmack Altwise said. On my watch, no one is above the law and everyone deserves justice. Baldwin and Gutierrez Reed will be, quote, charged in the alternative with the 2 counts of manslaughter, meaning that a jury would decide not simply if they were guilty, but under which definition of involuntary manslaughter they were guilty. The first charge can be referred to simply as involuntary manslaughter. For this charge to be proved, there must be underlying negligence. Under New Mexico law, involuntary manslaughter is a 4th-degree felony and is punishable by up to 18 months in jail and a $5,000 fine. This charge also includes the misdemeanor charge of negligent use of a firearm, which would likely merge as a matter of law.
And we'll talk about this more later, but it will merge as a matter of law. I don't know why they say likely. All that means is it's even though there are sort of 2 separate charges, you end up one charge is all you have, because in order to prove the one, it necessarily prove the other. So you don't have 2 charges, you just have 1 charge. It continues. The other charge is involuntary manslaughter in the commission of a lawful act. This charge requires proof that there was more than simple negligence involved in a death. This is also a 4th-degree felony, punishable by up to 18 months in jail and up to a $5,000 fine. This charge includes a firearm enhancement or added mandatory penalty because a firearm was involved. The firearm enhancement makes the crime punishable by a mandatory 5 years in jail. So in other words, if Baldwin is found guilty of this crime, he will be sentenced to at least 5 years in prison. He goes on, there's a quote, "If any of these 3 people, Alec Baldwin, Hannah Gutierrez Reed, or David Halls, had done their job, Helena Hutchins would be alive today. It's that simple," said Andrea Reeb, the special prosecutor appointed by the DA to the case. The evidence clearly shows a pattern of criminal disregard for safety on the Rust film set. In New Mexico, there is no room for film sets that don't take our state's commitment to gun safety and public safety seriously. Carmack, Altwise, and Reeb will formally file charges with New Mexico's First Judicial District Court before the end of the month. Following the filing of charges, each defendant will be issued a summons with the charging information. Shortly after receiving the summons, each defendant is required to make a, quote, first appearance, a procedure that is often referred to in other jurisdictions as an arraignment. In reality, usually the first appearance and the arraignment are different.
I was going to say, usually it's an initial appearance.
Yes. That first appearance can be done virtually, and defendants can even move to have their first appearance waived. First appearance dates are set by the court, not by the district attorney.
Sorry, this is such a weird press release, by the way.
Yes,
It's like
it is.
the reason this is weird, you guys, is not only is the subject matter weird, announcing charges beforehand, but this like weird mix of halfway explaining the law, halfway explaining the procedure, but not really getting either of them completely right. And also at a time, this is like not an appropriate sequence of events. Like, who are they advising of the first appearance? Alec Baldwin? No, because charges haven't even been filed. And they are such procedural things, it seems like a weird thing to put into a press release. That's why I say this is strange. Now, given that the first judicial district in New Mexico is only impaneling grand juries under certain circumstances due to ongoing COVID restrictions, the next step after first appearance will be a preliminary hearing. In this process, a judge takes on the role of the grand jury. The district attorney and the special prosecutor present their case to the judge. The judge then rules whether there is probable cause to move forward with a trial. The dates for a preliminary hearing will be set by the court, not by the district attorney. However, preliminary hearings are typically scheduled within 60 days of charges being filed. So my question earlier is answered here. It has not been brought before a grand jury, and I'm really interested here because it says that grand juries are impaneled if it's certain circumstances. I can't think of a certain circumstance you'd want a grand jury for more than something so high profile as charging Alec Baldwin with involuntary manslaughter in a case that's already pretty divided in terms of opinion. But this continues. There is a very clear process for pursuing justice in this case, Carmack Altwise said. We are committed to upholding the integrity of that process to ensure equal justice under the law. Once charges are filed, more detailed paperwork will be available online through the court that details the evidence the DA and the special prosecutor cite. An announcement will be made to the public when the charges have formally been filed. The district attorney received the final Santa Fe County Sheriff's Report on October 27, 2022, and moved quickly to carefully and thoughtfully review the evidence, allowing the DA to make her decision on charges less than 3 months after receiving the initiating report.
I feel like we could do an entire episode just on this press release.
I clearly haven't kept my opinion out of it. But this is a very bizarre press release. It really just is. I'm trying to explain to you guys why it's so bizarre because it may not seem on its face bizarre to you guys if you don't practice criminal law all the time. But I have no idea why this press release exists.
As we continue to talk about this, it's interesting to me, and we'll talk about this more, that David Halls, who's the assistant director, he has already entered into a plea agreement. It's interesting to me that he was allowed to do that. And I don't know what that says maybe about the relationship. For instance, I don't know if the DA's office reached out to Alec Baldwin and offered him a plea deal. It's possible they did and he rejected it. It's possible they offered plea deals to all these people, and David Halls was the first one to say yes. And so, he's getting the negligent use of a deadly weapon, which is a misdemeanor, and everybody else is getting charged with this felony, which could include a 5-year mandatory penalty. Let's talk about that more as we get through this and talk about the law and the facts. But something to keep in mind. Well, let's talk about the facts. For those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with exactly what happened, the sheriff's office prepared a 550-page report on the shooting that is available online. You can check it out if you want to. It's very long. Most of it is, like most reports, most of it is actually just boilerplate and documentation. But there are a lot of interview reports that are pretty interesting where the police have talked to various people who were there that day and what they saw. In preparation for filming a scene, this is basically the story that was told. In preparation for filming a scene, Hannah Gutierrez Reed, who is the assistant armorer. So the armorer is the person who handles all the weapons. Apparently the main armorer wasn't there that day, so she's the assistant. It's her job to get the weapons ready for whatever they're doing. And she loaded a revolver that Alec Baldwin would use in this scene that they were essentially blocking and rehearsing and seeing how it was going to look. I mean, they're doing all the things you do before you film a scene. You don't just call action and film the scene for the first time. By the time you film it, it's kind of like the difference between practice and playing a game. By the time you film it, everything's supposed to be ready and it's supposed to be easier and you know exactly what's going to happen. So they're setting up for the scene. She gives this revolver to Alec Baldwin. It is loaded with 6 rounds. Now, the reason it is loaded is because this is going to be a close-up shot. This is going to be a shot where you can really see the revolver. And the reason you need the bullets is because anybody who's ever looked at a revolver before, if it were empty, on the close-up shot, people would see that it's empty, and it would be one of those, blooper things that you see every now and then. Alec Baldwin holds empty revolver, that kind of thing. You're just trying to avoid that kind of stuff. I know that may seem silly to some of you, but I mean, the whole point of a movie is trying to make it seem real. So you put these dummy rounds in just for the purpose of it looking like there are bullets in the revolver. Now, Hannah Gutierrez Reed, she goes over to David Halls, who is the gentleman who has already pled guilty. He's the assistant director. She shows him the revolver. We've talked about revolvers before. You have this, the magazine for the revolver is in the middle of the revolver, and you load it that way. And so she shows him these bullets, and she tells him these are all dummy rounds. That means they don't fire at all. There are different kinds of rounds that you use in movies. You never use live rounds. You will occasionally use flash rounds that when you pull the trigger, they make a flash and it seems like it's a bullet. Dummy rounds are just for the looks. That's all this is supposed to be. They're not supposed to be live at all. And so the gun is called cold. It's a cold gun. Cold gun means there's no rounds in it at all. It's not going to fire at all. It's just for looks. And as I said, it doesn't even contain these flash rounds, much less live rounds, dummy rounds. She shows him the gun. She says these are all dummy rounds. He signs off on it. They hand the gun to Halls, at which point he hands the gun to Baldwin and tells him he wants him to show his action for the camera. We talked about how the director of filming is there, Helena, who is going to be shot. I mean, she's the director of cinematography. She's the one who sets up the cameras. They want to see how this gun is going to look. And show your action means, show the action you're going to go through in this scene. And in this case, he is supposed to draw the weapon and point it at the camera. But when he did so, the gun fires, stunning everyone.
Now, the scene involved Baldwin slowly taking the gun out of the holster and then turning and pointing it at the camera while cocking the gun. Like Brett said, this was a revolver, so cocking the gun means just drawing back the hammer of the gun. Baldwin has said he never pulled the trigger. I think he gave an interview at some point after the shooting and said he never pulled the trigger. And some have mocked him by asking how you can fire a gun without pulling the trigger. But here's the thing. It is possible. If the hammer falls on the round will fire. Baldwin was supposed to cock the hammer during the scene. Ordinarily, the hammer would stay back until the trigger was pulled. If you've ever played with a toy gun, it's like a spring, right? But it's supposed to stay back when you pull it. The single action revolver was common in the 1800s, again, period piece that he's filming here. But if for some reason the hammer didn't stay back, you can imagine something that you cock, whatever it is. It doesn't have to be a gun. Anything that's supposed to be kind of spring-loaded. If you don't pull it back enough, or for some reason the spring doesn't catch, the gun will fire when the hammer, springs back forward. Now, the FBI tested the gun, and it was widely reported that it could not be fired without pulling the trigger. But according to leaks from the testing, I don't know who leaked this, but there's going to be lots of rounds that they'd shoot from the gun. It seems that the gun was actually in very poor shape, to the extent that it fired one time and broke into two pieces afterwards. Now, does it matter whether Alec Baldwin pulled the trigger or not? Given the facts and the law, probably not.
And people talked about this a lot. Did he pull the trigger? Did he not pull the trigger? I think as we go through the law, you'll kind of see it probably doesn't matter. It's probably better for him if he didn't pull the trigger, though, I don't know. I mean, just a little bit better for him. But let's talk about the charges, because you can't talk about this without knowing the charges we're talking about and the way the law applies. We can all, talk about what happened and sort of talk about whether or not he was negligent, and whether or not he should have done this or he should have done that. But until you know what the law says, when it comes to whether or not charges are appropriate, you can't actually make a judgment. So just remember, you can think Alec Baldwin is a bad guy who did a bad thing, and there's not necessarily a charge that fits that. And we have two charges that he's been charged with, and they are basically the least culpable homicide you can have. This involuntary manslaughter is 4th-degree felony. I don't know that it is possible to kill someone and be charged with it and there be a lower charge than this. So it's already sort of the least serious charge. Let's see what it lays out. So there are two charges, as the press release says. There's involuntary manslaughter and involuntary manslaughter in the commission of a lawful act with a firearm. So let's read the statute so you get this. This is the statute. It's New Mexico statute section 30-2-3, and this is what it says. Involuntary manslaughter consists of manslaughter committed in the commission of an unlawful act not amounting to a felony, or in the commission of a lawful act which might produce death in an unlawful manner or without due caution and circumspection. So you can be charged for one of two reasons. One, you're doing something that's not lawful, but that is a misdemeanor. We talked about felony murder before. This is kind of the other version of that. You're doing something illegal that is just a misdemeanor and someone dies as a result. Obviously, you don't intend for them to die, but because you were committing a misdemeanor when they died, you can be charged with involuntary manslaughter. The other version is you're not doing anything illegal. You're doing something perfectly lawful, but you do it in some way without caution and circumspection that leads to this person's death. And we're going to break down these two charges for you and talk to you about what New Mexico law says about each one.
Now, let's do the second charge first because it's actually the easiest. To prove the second form of manslaughter, the prosecution must show recklessness, in which a defendant, quote, consciously disregards a substantial and unjustifiable risk that harm will result from his conduct. This is criminal negligence, in which a person, quote, acts with willful disregard of the rights or safety of others and in a manner which endangers any person or property. To be convicted of involuntary manslaughter, a defendant must have been aware of the risk caused by his or her conduct and continued to act. Criminal negligence in the context of involuntary manslaughter requires subjective knowledge by the defendant of the danger or risk to others posed by his or her actions, and that comes from a case State versus Henley from 2010. So the example we've used a lot before is like shooting into a crowd, right? You don't have to know that your bullet's going to hit someone. That is like a complete disregard, and it's an unjustifiable risk that you're taking by shooting into the air, but there are people around.
And I think in this case, I think if you shot into a crowd, it'd probably be a little bit worse. I think this is...
That's fair.
Well, just to keep the shooting thing going, let's say you're in your backyard on your property, and you're shooting at, let's just say you're shooting at bottles, and it's perfectly legal because you're on your property, and let's assume there's no rule against it, right? Ordinarily, if you were taking due care when you do something like that, you would put your bottles in front of a berm, sort of a big hill, so that any bullets that go through the bottle or miss the bottle will hit the berm and they will stop. Well, let's say you don't do that. Let's say instead you put the bottle on top of the hill and you're shooting, and when you shoot, you miss, and there's someone in the forest 1,000 yards away that you don't see and you don't even know they're there, and they get hit by the bullet and they die. You're doing a lawful thing, but you did it in such a way that you didn't take the kind of care you should have taken to make sure that anybody who you don't even know is there gets hurt and gets killed. That's the kind of thing we're talking about here. And ordinary negligence or civil negligence, so the kind of negligence that often results in lawsuits, is not enough. We're talking about criminal negligence here. So for instance, careless driving. Let's say you're not paying attention and you run a red light and you hit someone. So you don't even notice the light's red, maybe you're daydreaming, whatever. You are clearly negligent, but you hit someone and it results in their death. That is typically not enough for involuntary manslaughter. Even if you're being negligent to some extent, that is not criminal negligence, it's civil negligence. When their family sues you for that death, they're going to win because you were being negligent, but it takes something more than that. Under New Mexico law, an accidental killing is excusable because it is, quote, an unintended homicide which occurs in the course of performing a lawful act without criminal negligence. As in other cases of excusable homicide, the slayer is not criminally responsible, therefore, as an act that is committed accidentally does not involve a mental state cognizable to the criminal offense of murder and involuntary manslaughter. That is from State versus Lucero, which is a 2010 case. So all this to say, this is the second charge. And it, just on its face, requires a much higher level of negligence than maybe you're even thinking about in this case. Remember, if you're convicted of this, it also comes, because there's a gun involved, with a 5-year mandatory minimum. So you can imagine why this feels a little bit more serious. This requires recklessness, criminal negligence, not just typical negligence. And I think even in just hearing this described, you can see that this is probably not the charge that's going to stick. Because of this higher standard, because of what's required, it's hard to imagine that Alec Baldwin would be convicted of this crime.
Now, the heart of the first charge is that death resulted from an unlawful act. Here, the negligent use of a firearm. This is a petty misdemeanor in New Mexico.
And I'll just point out, this is what the one guy has already pleaded guilty to.
Yes, good point. Negligent use of a deadly weapon consists of 1, discharging a firearm into any building or vehicle or so as to knowingly endanger a person or his property. 2, carrying a firearm while under the influence of an intoxicant or narcotic. 3, endangering the safety of another by handling or using a firearm or other deadly weapon in a negligent manner. Or 4, discharging a firearm within 150 yards of a dwelling or building, not including abandoned or vacated buildings on public lands during hunting seasons, without the permission of the owner or lessees thereof. And that's from New Mexico Statute Section 30-7-4. Obviously, Part 3 is what will be at issue here. Remember, Number 3 was endangering the safety of another by handling or using a firearm or other deadly weapon in a negligent manner. So what do you need to show that? Well, a cursory review of New Mexico law would lead you to believe that it is civil, not criminal negligence, thus allowing for a much lower burden on the prosecution to prove. In State versus Grubbs, the New Mexico Court of Appeals held, quote, "The issue is whether a conviction of involuntary manslaughter by negligent use of a weapon requires negligence, which is different or greater than ordinary negligence. We hold that ordinary negligence is sufficient. That is, doing what a prudent and reasonable man would not do." Again, that case was State versus Grubbs from 1973. Now, negligence has been further defined as, quote, indifferent, careless, or offhand, and exercising a lack of reasonable care.
I can imagine that a lot of you are listening to that and you're nodding your head and you're thinking, yes, that's exactly it. That's the problem here. Is Alec Baldwin, whether he obviously didn't mean to do this, but he did not exercise the same care that he should have exercised. And what kind of care would that be? It's not what you or I would do. It's not just how you handle a gun. You would have to show that you were negligent in the handling of a weapon on a movie set, which is very different. You know, people have said things like, you can't point a gun at somebody and expect not to be held responsible. When you're filming a movie, you do that all the time. You can't film someone shooting at the camera without shooting at someone. I mean, that's just the way it works, right? So what you have to show is, in the way he handled it, he was negligent. And you've heard some people who are actors say things like, whenever I get a cold gun, the first thing I do is point it at the ground and pull the trigger, and he should have done that. And that's the kind of standard you're looking at here. What would a reasonable person acting reasonably on a movie set when handed a cold weapon do? And if he did not do what they would do, then he would be negligent. If he does what every other person would do in the professional way to handle it, then even if something bad happens as a result of it, it's not negligence. Even if you think, how could you point a gun and pull a trigger? If that's what you do every time you're in a movie, it's not negligence. It's kind of like, you know, if you're a NASCAR driver, you pull in front of people at 180 miles an hour, giving them 6 inches of space, and sometimes that leads to a wreck. But you're not criminally responsible for that, and you're not being negligent. If you or I do that on the interstate, we would probably be even more than negligent. You have to consider it in the circumstances in which the person is in. So, if this is the standard, as this case seems to say, then Alec Baldwin, he could have a real problem, because it seems like he probably is civilly negligent. He probably didn't exercise all the care he should have exercised. But here's the thing. The law has developed a good bit since 1973, and the Court of Appeals appears to have changed its mind. No, we're not experts on New Mexico law, but if you spend a couple hours looking at this, this is the kind of thing you'll find. An intervening decision called Santillanes, I'm going to go with that, addressing a different legal issue appears to have implicitly overruled Grubbs. And Santillane is a Supreme Court of New Mexico case. Remember, Grubbs is a Court of Appeals case. Here's what the Court of Appeals said after Santillanes came out. We interpret Santillanes as requiring a standard of negligence which coincides with the punishment. In other words, a petty misdemeanor, such as negligent use of a deadly weapon, properly requires a showing of only ordinary civil negligence. However, when used as the basis for involuntary manslaughter, a petty misdemeanor is elevated to a felony and as such requires a showing of criminal negligence. Consequently, we interpret Santillanes as implicitly overruling Grubbs, to the extent that Judge Bivens' special concurrence in State v. Franklin interprets Santillanes as requiring a showing of only civil negligence for involuntary manslaughter by negligent use of a firearm, which is exactly what we have here. We disagree and hold otherwise. Therefore, we hold that a showing of criminal negligence is required for conviction of involuntary manslaughter, whether based on the unlawful act or lawful act portion of the statute and irrespective of the underlying statutory basis for the conviction. And that is State versus Yarborough in 1995.
So why doesn't this include the use of a firearm enhancement like in count 2? The unlawful act at issue is the negligent use of a firearm. The fact you used a firearm negligently is the only reason you can be charged with the offense. But the law is clear that you cannot enhance a sentence with conduct that is the same as the offense itself. Otherwise, the offense itself would always have a 5-year penalty instead of an 18-month one. So it's kind of like a massive loophole that would just swallow the entire statute. And in State versus Franklin, a case from 1993, the court wrote, because the state would not be required to prove any additional facts in order to have defendant's sentence enhanced, we conclude that the firearm enhancement statute is subsumed within the offense of involuntary manslaughter by negligent use of a firearm. And on like the basic principles of fairness, you can understand why that would be the case, because the statute wasn't written to have a 5-year mandatory minimum. It was said to have an 18-month penalty, which is very different. But if you were to subsume that enhancement within the statute, then you're always going to get the 5-year mandatory minimum, or a 5-year penalty, I should say, not mandatory minimum.
So you have a situation here where count 2 is the one with a 5-year mandatory minimum. And when you first read count 2 and you think about this whole criminal negligence thing, you think, well, it's going to be really hard for them to prove that. So that probably falls away. And then you turn to count 1, which only has 18 months because you can't have this firearm enhancement, like Alice was just saying. And so it's only 18 months, but you're comforted, if you're the prosecution, in the idea of, well, at least we only have to prove civil negligence here. So yeah, lesser penalty, but lower burden. Unfortunately, as we have read to you, it seems like that is wrong. It seems like, in fact, you have to prove recklessness. You have to prove criminal negligence for both of these charges. And what does that mean? I think the bottom line here, and I hesitate to say this because if it's true, it's really shocking. And as I said, not an expert in New Mexico law. Spent a couple hours looking at this, so may very well be wrong. Looking forward to someone from New Mexico telling me I'm wrong. But it seems to me that the state has this wrong, that the state is walking into a buzzsaw and may not even realize they are. Let's look again at that press release that we read and how they describe these two charges. The first charge can be referred to simply as involuntary manslaughter. For this charge to be proved, there must be underlying negligence. The other charge is involuntary manslaughter in the commission of a lawful act. This charge requires proof that there was more than simple negligence involved in a death. The way these two charges are described seems to indicate that the state believes that there are two different negligence standards for these two different charges. And when Grubbs was good law, they would have been right. They did have different standards, but it seems like they don't anymore. And as hard as it is to believe, you have to wonder if the state messed this up. If the state believes, for whatever reason, that Grubbs is still good law and hasn't been overruled. And if that's what they believe, I think this could get really bad for them really fast, because it's hard to believe that this is a recklessness type charge. If you look at the kind of cases that have involuntary manslaughter, the things people are doing with firearms are much worse than what we have here. I mean, just remember, you have Alec Baldwin, who's an actor. The assistant armorer comes up with the gun, says it's loaded with dummies, gives it to the first assistant, tells him it's loaded with dummies. He checks it, believes it's loaded with dummies, gives it to Alec Baldwin. Even if Alec Baldwin should have taken another step, even if he was negligent in not doing so, that negligence is civil negligence. It is not criminal negligence. It is not recklessness. He was not being reckless, considering all the other factors. The fact that this is a movie set, the fact that the professionals have looked at this gun and told him it's cold, and everybody knows Alec Baldwin doesn't like guns, so he's not going to know any better. The fact that all that happened, you're not going to show recklessness. It's just not going to happen. So if the state believes that's okay because we're going to go in on charge one and show negligence and win, I think they're wrong. And maybe somebody can show me a case from after this where they changed their mind, but I think they could be mistaken here.
Yeah, well, there's some free advice for both Hannah and Alec. It would be shocking if there were a case after 1995, because the original 1973 Grubbs case just didn't even sound fair, right? There was deeply seated to have only ordinary negligence didn't make sense for a criminal type case. And so we'll see. I mean, that's why this press release is so weird. They've kind of laid out everything, and it seems like someone should have fact-checked it at the very least. I don't know why. I don't know. I guess I don't live in New Mexico, and I don't know the media hype around it. I would be surprised if there have been people standing outside the DA's office on a daily basis, demanding charges because otherwise she's somehow soft on gun safety. I'm not sure. That might be the case, but it seems like a strange, almost electioneering type move that's just incorrect on the law and the facts.
And let's go back to this plea agreement. So Assistant Director David Halls, one of the people who looked at the gun and assured Alec Baldwin that it's full of dummy rounds, he pled guilty to negligent use of a deadly weapon. I'm not saying Alec Baldwin shouldn't have been charged. He should have been charged with negligent use of a deadly weapon, which, because it's a misdemeanor, has that simple negligence aspect to it. So you could have charged Alec Baldwin with that, and I think you would have gotten a conviction. And maybe you could have charged Hannah Gutierrez Reed with this higher level, because one of the things that's said a lot, and I don't know if this has ever been confirmed, is that the people on the set and some of the armorers and everything else were taking the guns that were being used in filming out into the desert and shooting them and using live rounds. And that's how this live round got there. It got kind of mixed in with the other bullets and was accidentally loaded into the gun, and that's how it was fired. And maybe that means that Gutierrez Reed could be charged with this, but not Alec Baldwin. And let me also say this. Alec Baldwin is a producer, and so maybe you want to try to make some sort of argument, and they kind of do this in the press release of like, he's responsible for everything that happened on that set, and if somebody got shot because of negligence on the set, he's responsible for that. Civilly, sure, go for it. Sounds like a great theory. Probably going to win. That's not how criminal law works. Criminal law does not typically, unless you yourself have some knowledge and you are intentionally allowing some sort of conduct to continue that ends up being deadly. Imagine the CEO of a company who knows that the company is dumping toxic waste somewhere and people die, right? You could imagine that CEO getting charged. But just the fact of being a CEO, when someone underneath you does something criminal, does not mean that you will be criminally responsible, even if you are civilly responsible. So that's not going to matter. You really have to show that Alec Baldwin himself, in that moment, did something that was so reckless that it rises to this level of recklessness and criminal negligence. And I'm sorry, I don't see it. I don't see it, and I don't think the state's going to be able to prove it. And unfortunately, I don't think the state realizes that they have to prove it. I think they think they're going to walk in, prove simple negligence, and because that's good enough for negligent use of a deadly weapon, it's going to be good enough for manslaughter. And it's not. And like I said, if you're a New Mexico lawyer and you know more about this, and you know there was a case from 2010 that said, no, we got it right in Grubbs, and now that's the law, let us know. Happy to do a follow-up. Happy to talk more about that because that would be interesting as well. The development of law is always interesting. But when I look at this, and I can see how it happened because, and this is only going to mean anything to those of you who are lawyers, if you go in, you're researching New Mexico law, you're trying to figure out what the standard is. You go to the statute for not involuntary manslaughter, because that's not actually where you find it. You have to go to the statute for negligent use of a firearm. You go into that statute, you read the statute, you look at the decisions that have been made about this case. You go into the decisions, you find the negligence section. The negligence section, for reasons that aren't entirely clear to me, points you to grubs. So you read the negligence section, and it says, and grubs is where it talks about negligence. And you click on that, and it takes you there, and it tells you exactly what we said. But then, if you look at grubs and you keep going, you find Yarborough. And Yarborough is what tells you, no, that's fine just for negligent use of a firearm, but it's not fine for manslaughter. And it's like they never took that additional step. And it's hard to believe they would do that in a case that is this serious and this publicized. And that's why it won't shock me if somebody writes in and says, no, you got it wrong because, New Mexico passed this statute afterwards. It made it clear. And like I said, happy to follow up on this. But as I sit here today, I think the state's got it wrong.
And here's the thing, guys. Lawyers make mistakes. You try not to, but the process of research that Brett just walked through, that's called like shepherdizing a case, right? That's called following all the decisions that may or may not come after it, that may discuss it. And that is like the key of legal research. Sometimes you do miss a case. I think both of us have experiences where we've made legal arguments in court and like the court smacked us down and was like, you're wrong because you missed this key case. It's happened to me before and it's a terrible feeling. But to say that this is why doing other research or having peers to check your work is very important, because we don't just get to open up like a code book that tells us everything. We are a common law system, which means that it's not a math equation, right? We don't just like type in the facts and then find the relevant law and it spits out exactly what we get. We actually have to do legal research, and that's why you pay lawyers money, when you hire them in order to do this type of work. So we'll see what happens. I'm interested to see, how this unfolds, and interested to hear your thoughts on it as well. I am just like tripping over my words all up and down tonight. So before I trip over more words, Brett, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I'll tell you what, though. We talked about why did they do this way? Why did they do the press release the way they did it? I don't think this is what they intended, but I feel like there has been a pretty strong reaction to this, that this is overreach, that they've gone too far on this. And you wonder if before the end of the month they change their mind. And maybe they continue to pursue this charge against the assistant armorer, but they go for the lesser charge against Alec Baldwin. If they do that, obviously they're going to face a huge backlash from people who really want to see Alec Baldwin punished, to the full extent of the law or whatever. But I don't know. I'll be curious to see how this goes. We will continue to follow this. It would not shock me if whatever happens at the end of the month, Baldwin ends up pleading guilty to a negligent discharge of a firearm type charge, and this never actually goes to trial. But I think if it does go to trial, and it goes to trial with these charges, he will win.
Well, we've waited out there. We never mince our words when we think we know the outcome. So we'll see how this plays out, and interested to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks for asking us to cover this case. I found it very interesting. I hope you did as well. And thank you guys for listening to this podcast, as well as The Prosecutors, our main podcast. And for all of those 5-star reviews, please keep them coming. They really do warm our hearts, especially in these cold January days, almost end of January. But until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is The Prosecutors' Legal Briefs. I was just like, I'm like Cinderella. It's like by 8:30, I'm like, oh no, going off the cliff.
No, I hear you. I'm here for you.
I'm
I got your back.
almost. It's like a 2-week thing, right? I'm like into week 1, so we're almost there. Helena Hutchins. Dang it, what was she? Cinematographer? I'm terrible at this.
I think she was a cinematographer.
Helena.
I'm surprised it's not in here.
No. It's just like you read about it and you forget what. Okay, wait.
'Cause it
Director
also
of
wounded the
photography.
director.
Director of photography. Okay, sorry. I'm going to start over.